I very calmly headbutt him in the mouth. However, he had 2 years on me, trained in some swordplay, and he was a boy. He beat me up until my mother and grandfather showed up. I wasn't invited to any parties after that, but I also didn't really care. I took my education a lot more seriously, and I spent my free time fishing off of one of my grandfather's warboats. He was impressed that I could catch a fish that was bigger than my head with improvised sticks and cloth string, that I could file, gut, and build a fire and cook a fish. In the few months I was with those trolls, I learned more than most of my tutors could ever teach me. My grandfather Magnus Dawnlight, the Navy General of Silver Moon, came to my fire while I was cooking what I caught. "Perfectia, you learned how to be self-sustaining?" he asked, surprised. I didn't know what that word meant, and I had caught 3 fish that day, so I offered him the skewered fish I was cooking. "Your mother's father." I had seen him before and just knew that mother called him father. "Yes, and that makes me your grandfather." "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked and took the fish. I started to skewer and cook the next one. I was conflicted and started crying. "I'm not allowed to say. I promise no one will hurt you again. You can tell me anything." So, I talked about what happened to the trolls, not just about the disturbing executions, but how I lost people I cared about. He stood there as I let this whole confession out, and that I didn't want to be a mage. I expected him to get angry or tell me that they weren't people, and they were animals, but he just said, "I understand. It's not your fault." I told him I wanted to sail like he did, and I wanted to be able to fight like he could. My grandfather said with a strange smile, "Well, Perfectia, you're going to have to learn how to use a sword. But it won't be easy." I nodded and he ran me through the basics for about an hour, but we never trained for less than an hour. We would get to a certain point, and he would say, "Okay, Perfectia, that's enough." I would say, "I'm not tired. I can keep going." And we would train for another hour. From that point on, he would fight a little harder with each passing hour. But speaking through his practice lessons as he sparred, but when he was quiet, he fought stronger and faster as he focused. There were times other soldiers would come by and say, "General, you had a scheduled appointment?" He would reply with, "Can't you see I'm doing something important right now, reschedule." For about 6 months I learned swordplay, sometimes with him, sometimes with one of his soldiers. He was strict, but he told me it wasn't going to be easy, so I accepted that. He would make me fight grown men holding nothing back, knocking me back on the ground. He would keep his arms crossed discontent and say, "Another," and I would get back up and fight the soldier until I was knocked down again, and he would say, "Another," again. If I got discouraged, he would remind me of the trolls and he would say, "You wanted to protect those trolls from your mother, didn't you?" I nodded my head, my nose bloody and body covered in bruises from getting hit with wooden weapons. Mages won't let you start over once they knock you down. You know how merciless they are. He would put a hand on his armored soldier. "This is just a man, but a mage will be monstrous." I nodded and kept the drill going. There was this one time his other soldiers had this idea that if I did do something like a performance or a fight choreography, my grandfather might be impressed. I was supposed to take on 6 armored soldiers at once. I ran drills and choreography with the other soldiers without my grandfather knowing, where I jumped, strike, ducked, and parried and defeated all 6 of them in a fashionable style that looked more like a dance. I remember I performed for my grandfather that sat there with the same look of discontent he sometimes had. I did all of the flashy moves from the choreography I learned to beat one of the armored soldiers. Then 2, then 3, and then all 6, and I got a round of applause from his other soldiers. My grandfather just stood there discontent, rolling his eyes, shaking his head, and even somewhat angry. I thought I would get something out of him after I took on all 6 heavy armored soldiers that seemed to be knocked out. Everyone seemed happy and entertained, except him. He stepped forward, looked around at all his other soldiers that were pretending to be knocked out, and he said to them, "Get up." And they did as they were ordered. "Now, fight her for real." They were his soldiers, and they looked at my grandfather bewildered. "General, she's a child. Your granddaughter." He nodded. "I know. I need you to fight her like you're trying to kill her, and I'll tell you when to stop." He pointed at me. "This one is not a dancer, Dash." I stepped back and shook my head. Perfectia, if you run away, I'll make sure you never see a sword again. He screamed and raged. I put my head down and I looked at the 6 members I had run choreography with for the past few weeks, and I nodded my head at them. Now fight. Grandfather ordered calmly. The choreography I learned did help a little. I was able to hit some of them with the flashy moves I learned, but my small frame and wooden weapon couldn't do enough impact to their metal armor. When they started swinging at me with their wooden weapons, I dodged, but eventually one of them was able to strike me in the back, and it stung as the elf that was most likely 4 times my size hit me with his wooden weapon. The soldier that hit me looked at me with a look of empathy as I was hit, and they all stopped. That made my grandfather even more angry. He ran over to the soldier that hit me in the back, grabbed him from his armor, and said, "Hold back like that again, and I'll kill you right here." He pulled a steel bar from behind him, and it extended into a spear. His weapon of choice. He banged one end on the sand twice. "Now, again," he ordered. I was scared now, and as the strikes came, I could only think of blocking, which doesn't work when you're a child fighting 6 heavy armored grown men. The first one came in as I blocked high and hit me on the top of my head through my defense, one across the jaw, and another at my calf, knocking me to the ground. I fell on the floor somewhat relieved, hoping to hear my grandfather say another, again. Some of them knew that if I fell down, they were supposed to stop. "What are you waiting for? I told you to keep going until I tell you to stop," I heard grandfather say. They started kicking me like I was a snake in the grass. It hurt, and I kept myself covered, curled in a ball, but I knew they were holding back. I heard my grandfather take a weapon away from one of his soldiers. Not like that. Like this. He came down with all his might with the side of the weapon on my kidney. I screamed and grabbed it in pain and came out of the ball. They came with their weapons this time, hitting me. There was one time my grandfather stopped one of his soldiers and said, "No, stabs. You are not really trying to kill her. Keep going." For about 5 painful minutes of crying and trying to keep myself covered, my grandfather finally said, "Stop. You're all dismissed." They left, and my grandfather walked toward me as I laid there in excruciating pain. "I know you think that was cruel of me." I looked up at him somewhat out of breath, in pain, and looked down as I remembered something he said, "But mages are even more cruel," I recited. I heard something that sounded like a slight laugh. "Yes, they are." He picked me up. "Come on, Perfectia, I'll take you to the Sunwell." I remember him taking me there and submerging my body in the water. He looked at me strangely. "Wow," he said as he looked at me in the water, "they really do turn gold." He was referring to my eyes. For some reason my eyes turned gold when I was in the Sunwell's water, even when I was just playing in there. I don't know why the Sunwell's magic works the way it works, but if you're injured, sick, or you've just been away for a long time, it has this funny way of making you feel euphoric. I lost track of what my grandfather might have been saying as he held me there. I felt like I was drifting off, and his voice seemed distant as I fell asleep. After that day, I tried to avoid my grandfather, and I really started rethinking my idea of being a swordsman. I traveled far away from his ships to fish, and I didn't mind if I got my feet wet. But he tracked me down. "You never missed a practice before, Perfectia," he complained. I shrugged, not looking at him. I didn't feel like it today. I wanted to fish. "Well, you could have brought your fishing line to one of my ships," he explained. I only shrugged, not making any eye contact since the conversation began. "Well, you should at least watch the other men practice," he suggested. I looked at him finally. No, he repeated in disbelief. "Who do you think you are?" I looked away from him. "The terror of the Sunwell, and you broke your promise, Grandpa. You're still a child, and sometimes a child needs to be punished, so you're coming with me," he ordered. I didn't respond, but he came closer to the water's edge and reached for me. I disengaged, leaning my head and body back, and lunged forward with the fishing pole, putting it in his left eye. I felt a slight resistance of his flesh, then a give when his eye popped like a water balloon. He screamed in pain as he grabbed the left side of his face. "You little terror." He screamed and looked at me with his good eye, but I kept sidestepping to his left like we practiced. I pointed the end of the stick at him in a tierce fencing position, pointing near him, my left hand above my head. You're not the first kin I've slayed, Perfectia. He yelled at me. I wouldn't doubt that. But you had 6 men before and now you have a blind side, I said while sidestepping to his left. I looked for an opening in his body as he was trying pretty hard to protect his face and neck with his hand outward. I lunged at his kidney on what I thought was cloth, but there was something hard under there. He grabbed my stick and snatched it out my hand. I started running and he chased after me, grabbed me by my clothes and held me at his side like a sack of potatoes. I bit and clawed and screamed at him to let me go. I didn't know what he was going to do or take me, but he took me to the practice area full of sand where we trained. He threw me on the circular sand pit. Stay there. He screamed at me, and I was scared frozen trying to cover myself, run Perfectia through her swordplay lesson I prepared for her. He barked toward one of his soldiers and looked over at me angrily. I need medical attention. And he left, and that was the only time he lost his temper with me. I looked at one of my older grown-up cousins, Dorian Dawnridge, a high elf with a long red ponytail. Grandfather wants you to work on a wooden dummy he designed. He laughed and shrugged slightly. It was kind of a surprise present. I picked up a practice sword that was around the practice circle and ran back to Dorian. I don't think you're going to need that. He brought me to a hard wooden dummy. I knocked on the wood. It's kind of hard. Most of the dummies I work with are laced in fabric and hay and then wood, I stated. He nodded. I know. But this is supposed to represent an enemy in armor. He tightened some screws on the dummy and its limbs held in place. Look here. He put pressure on the moving parts of the arm and the limb made a popping noise and came off. This is how you break a man's arm. He shrugged slightly. You usually start learning how to use this after you learn sword and shield, but grandfather wants you to start now. He looked at me suspiciously. Did you stab him in the eye? I looked downward. No. I lied. He laughed and put the arm back on the dummy. You try. I was short and light, and this was extremely difficult as I pressed and pushed and struck with my sword. And even when I stood on that darn dummy and tried to jump on the weak side, I just ended up slipping off the thing because the limb would slide down if there was too much weight on it. Cousin Dorian tried to show an easy break that could be done with the legs if it was on a locked knee. He made that look easy. I got a running start and tried to drop kick the locked knee with both of my legs. That didn't work either. I tried to use my sword to see if I could pry the limbs off. I rested the arm of the dummy on my shoulder, put the sword on the breaking point, and pulled it down with both hands, and that didn't work. I tried everything to get that dummy to break, only taking breaks to eat. Around sunset, I just kept hitting it out of frustration that it wouldn't break. I could barely put clips in the dummy. I must have gone through 5 or 10 practice swords that broke in half. I remember screaming, "You stupid dummy! You stupid, stupid dummy!" and broke another wooden sword over its hard face. But this time the wood snapped back and hit me in the face, making me fall on the ground, holding my face and crying. I was about to walk away, but my grandfather was there. The sun had already gone down, so I didn't notice him show up. The left side of his face was wrapped in bandages, and there was still a spot of blood over the bandages where his eye used to be. "You weren't about to quit, were you?" he asked me. I looked at him shocked and concerned. "Grandpa, I shook my head and held the side of my arm. I thought, maybe if I used a real sword. He shook his head. "You're not ready for that yet." He sighed. "You need to loosen the bolts so the limb's loose. You need to pull quickly, and once the arm is fully extended, then you strike the weak point. Even a child could do that, but the timing has to be perfect." I sometimes forget when people use the word perfect, they're not always referring to me. I loosened the bolts so that the limbs were wobbling from side to side. I tried to do it like he said, but it wasn't working. I kept slipping. "It's just my name, Grandpa. I can't do it." I cried. He raised his eyebrow at me. "Stop crying." He shook his head. "That's the first time I've heard you say that." He laughed slightly. "Don't go to the sunwell tonight. At least for a few days. I want your muscles to be sore tomorrow. You're going to eat eggs for breakfast, and we're going to do this again." I nodded sadly. "Grandpa, I'm really sorry about your eye." He looked away and shook his head. "Go to sleep, Perfectia." So, the next day I started my strength and resistance training in the morning with some of his Navy sailors, even before I ate breakfast, and I tried the methods my grandfather told me to use, but it still wasn't working, but I was less frustrated this time. Cousin Dorian showed me a few breaking techniques, but he was still a grown man. He showed me that the head could come off if he twisted it to the side. He was able to get the wooden dummy's head to twist if he really wound up a strike with a practice sword, but my sword usually broke in half when I tried to do that. He showed me this technique where my feet were square, knees slightly bent, and I held the sword in a kami stance. That's a sword point facing upwards, holding the grip near the center of your chest. Also, I'm about to say a lot of stuff and explain about a million things about swordplay. So, if you're not interested in that, you can just skip the next few paragraphs because you might think this is boring. At least that's how the hands were kept. Hands on top of each other, but he wanted me to hold the sword from behind my head as opposed to keeping it in front of me. We talked about this sword swing for about an hour before he would let me get a full motion of how it was done. How I was supposed to move my front foot to emphasize timing. I was supposed to bring my front shoulder down lower than my back shoulder to create an axis that I can swing around, so when I got to the point of contact my shoulders would switch. My front shoulders would be higher and my back shoulder would be lower. I really feel I need to mention this technique with emphasis. I'm sure there are a lot of people that know nothing about swords except that the pointy end goes into the other man, and this might sound like a foreign language, but I still use it today when fighting a beast of prey. Out of all the different sword techniques I do know, this has been my foundation. Because if you begin your sword swing from this starting point, you can really feel your hips and lower half almost pulling the sword through the point of contact. This is where my power comes from, and I think a lot of men swing a sword the same way they chop wood using only arms and back muscles. But when you're chopping a tree, you're not trying to get the axis stuck in the wood. Anyways, Cousin Dorian showed me an exercise so my back leg and the butt of the sword were moving at the same time, and even before my first swing I did this exercise for over 20 minutes. Back and forth, making sure my back heel raised up and my front foot launched forward slightly. I was feeling a lot of stress and tension in my thighs and hips from this exercise. Even after I was finally able to do a full swing, Cousin Dorian still had a lot of say about my form, how I need to keep my elbows the same distance through the whole swing until I hit the point of contact. This whole thing made me more than a little frustrated. It seemed boring, tedious, and he was ordering me around for over 2 hours over and over something that should have only taken 1 or 2 seconds to execute, and I finally snapped. This is so stupid. You really expect someone to just stand there and let me swing at them while doing all these stupid steps? He rolled his eyes. It's about timing and swing accuracy, Perfectia. I looked at him slightly confused and shrugged my shoulders. I didn't understand what that meant. Right place, right time? He tried to explain better, but I still wasn't getting it. He let out a sigh. I guess it will be easier to show than to try to explain this to you. He walked away from the training area and came back with a smooth apple-sized stone and a heavier training sword and positioned himself so that he was facing the ocean but still in front of me. Timing, he said as he held the stone in his hand in front of me and the training sword in the other. He tossed the stone in the air slightly, went through all the steps, and swung the training sword at the stone in midair. The sound made such a loud crack that it made my ears hurt, and I saw the stone fly hundreds of yards away and splash into the ocean water. And accuracy. Oh my gosh, that was amazing. I said in awe when I saw the stone fall in the ocean. Cousin Dorian laughed slightly. Thanks, my father used to take me to a lot of town ball games when I was a child. What's town ball? Is that like a party? I asked excitedly. He grunted out a slight laugh and shook his head slightly as he remembered back. It's a game we used to play with humans, but the rules vary from place to place, but there hasn't been a seasonal game since the orcs showed up. I don't understand. He sighed and shook his head. Why don't we get you back on the sword swing? Yeah, I said, excited now. I really wanted to see if I could actually do what he just did. It looked easy, but it wasn't. But he was more encouraging, and I was less resentful as I tried to hit small stones with my training sword. Cousin Dorian showed me there was a certain sweet spot around the side of the chin that could make the dummy's head fly off. He gave it a few tries with his training sword, and even with that big wind-up he couldn't pull it off, but I did hear some give from the dummy, like he might have been getting close. I mimicked his techniques, but the strength in my arms and legs was gone. Usually when I was in any pain at all I would run to the sunwell, but I put up with the pain for reasons unknown to me at the time. I was just thinking I didn't want to disappoint my grandfather. When grandfather showed up at 4 p.m. and asked me if I had been to the sunwell today, I said no, and he said, good. He showed me more deep-rooted stances of pulls and pushes. There was a quick count of 1, 2, and the dummy's limb just came flying off. He would make me run through the exercises on the dummy and a lot of holding myself in place in single closed and wide stances, with the same strictness and discontent look he always had. Repeating, again, more times than I could count. He still had the bandages on his face, but they weren't blood-soaked. Lastly, he made me eat meat and vegetables, and I really didn't like eating anything in the first place. But as the sun came down, he had someone bring him and me meat from land animals and vegetables, and it felt a little like when I would sit by the fire with the trolls, except I could actually understand. The next day was pretty much the same thing except that in the morning I started running with a few dozen of grandfather's sailors, but I could only keep up with them for about a quarter of the island before they broke away from me. At least for the first day. But my mother did in fact ask me if I took grandfather's eye during breakfast. I said I was sorry. I told her. The third day, a few hours before sundown, I finally managed to break off one of the leg limbs on the dummy. I looked back at my grandfather in celebration, and he only smiled for a second, nodded, and said, again. I could only do it once. I guess he knew I got lucky. After about a week, I was able to break off a few limbs of the dummy, and I wondered how I could possibly feel stronger from being away from the sunwell for so long. However, my grandfather stopped showing up, and after being able to use Cousin Dorian's grappling and swinging techniques to break off the limbs, I was ready to go back to traditional swordplay and fencing. I saw my grandfather a lot more often than I saw my mother, but that still wasn't a lot compared to how much time I spent training alone. There were also educators that tried to teach me how to read, write, basics of math, and even a few classes on how to speak the human language common. Well, I won't say I exiled in, but the choreographers that beat me up told me that there was a Lordaeron Silvermoon Friendship Week where humans, dwarves, night elves, and even gnomes could come to any part of the city to engage in festivities. They were supposed to reenact the Troll Wars along with a few other things, and they wanted me to do a demonstration. I asked my grandfather this time if I could do it. He said, if you promise to keep working on the limb dummy, then yes. Just like before I trained for the next event. My mother even stayed for a few hours to watch the team do their demonstration with me. She brought friends to show off the fact that I could be an enchantress, or a battle sorceress, or a red mage. These combat classes don't exist anymore if they ever existed at all, but I have heard stories from books she read about crosses of arcane magic and swordplay. Frankly, I think she just came to brag. That day came, but unlike before, I wasn't the center stage girl like I was before. There were people that did several choreographies, not only direct combat, but brick breaking, sequences of movements that the whole team had to memorize and perform. We all did what we were supposed to and gave a final bow at the end. But grandfather, however, came walking in front of us, slowly clapping his hands as he came forward. Great performance, men, he said to the whole team. Perfectia. Since I was the only girl. Now, fight my granddaughter for real. The crowd that was behind him seemed somewhat shocked, but the people I was working with seemed less surprised, and they all looked over at me. We're sorry, Perfectia, but he paid us. I looked over at my grandfather. He smirked at me and winked with his one eye. Fight her like you're trying to kill her, and I'll tell her when to stop, he said. All of them had their weapons at the ready. There were about 10 of them, but they weren't in armor like before, but one of them looked over at my grandfather for a second and said, wait, what do you mean her? He was the first one to get slammed with a wooden demo sword on the side of the chin with the town ball swing. I remember hearing the cold break of his neck like I managed to do on the dummy, and I heard the crowd let out a sound of sympathy and worry. These performers were used to fair duels and flashy swinging sword movements. I always started low, and if the calf bone or kneecaps didn't break, I would stab or strike with the wooden sword to the groin. There was one man that tried to grab me from behind. He lost an eye when I put my wooden sword there from behind me, and the rest were like scared sheep. Not just my own weapon, because that broke into pieces from that first strike, but I took theirs as well. Since the knee stomp was the only break on the wooden dummy, I could successfully do 9 times out of 10. I did that most of the time, but there were a few broken arms and bitten off fingers. They faced off with me using their flashy sword spins and kicks, but that didn't go well for them. The style I was using, well, I wouldn't even call it a style. It was very ugly, and I left that arena looking like a crowded war zone tent hospital. I remember everyone outside of the arena being shocked and appalled. I heard a few in disbelief saying, "This is just a show, right? They're not really hurt, are they?" And many of them were even physically sick. But I looked over at my grandfather amidst all the booing and scared panicking, and he was so proud there were tears in his eyes, and I thought, anything to make him happy, anything. He hugged me for the first time. I was happy for those past few months. The name Terror of the Sun, well, finally felt like a badge of pride, but it was short-lived, because we all know what happened when Arthas came to Silvermoon.